6TR, the bright side of Staffordshire.
Steve Penk, thanks for joining us on the line today to talk about radio. How are you doing?
You're very welcome. Yes, it's nice to be here.
Great stuff. This is not a wind-up, by the way. This is a proper phone call just to talk about radio. I've just read up that in 2018, it's going to be 40 years since you first graced the airwaves.
Crikey, it really is, isn't it? Yeah. 1978 was the year that I joined what was Piccadilly Radio in Manchester.
Yeah.
As a little fresh-faced 16-year-old. In fact, I left school on the Friday and joined Piccadilly Radio in Manchester on the Monday. And yeah, they really were wonderful times, yeah.
Yeah, we spoke to Paul Carrington about his time, because he started off at Piccadilly working with Timmy Mallet and Chris Evans, etc. And he said that it was based under a car park, Piccadilly Radio was. Obviously, it's Q103 now, but in those days, it was quite a busy hub where they had quite a lot of celebrities coming down. And it was a breeding ground for talent as well, wasn't it, Steve?
It was, yeah. It was in the Piccadilly Plaza, Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester, and it was below what was the old Piccadilly Hotel, and it was a hotel. It was like the main hotel in Manchester, where all the stars stayed when they came to town. Either they were playing the Manchester Apollo, or they were playing one of the clubs around the town. So it really was central. It was. I mean, I can remember many, many stories of artists that came into the radio station, and the Plaza area was just rammed. I mean, I can remember, people like David Cassidy coming in at his peak, and Barry Manilow coming in at his peak, and Paul McCartney and people like that, and it just being rammed. And in fact, a very, very quick aside. When people used to come to the radio station, anybody who came to the radio station had to sign, the book, the visitor's book. So from the radio station launching, Piccadilly Radio launched in Manchester in 1974, and so all the stars that came in, and literally, everybody you could possibly think of at some point came into that radio station. Anyway, the point I'm getting to is that somebody thought in the early 90s it would be a great idea to give away that book as a prize to a listener. So, all these amazing people that had signed this book, literally from Paul McCartney to just everybody you can think of in television, in music, and they gave it away as a prize. So somebody somewhere in Greater Manchester has this amazing book sat in their house somewhere.
A piece of history, Steve. That's what it is.
A real piece of history, absolutely. I'd like to get my hands on that. It'd be worth a bloody fortune.
It really would. So as a fresh-faced 16-year-old coming out to school, what was it that enticed you to go into radio of all careers?
I'd always loved radio from being from being a kid, really. I mean, I got into music, I suppose, when I was about 8 or 9, and would spend all my pocket money on records. You'd go down to the record shop, and at the weekend, and you'd buy your vinyl record, and the excitement of getting it home and putting it on the turntable.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where it started for me, and then in my early teens, I started volunteering for hospital radio, and many of us, that get into radio, that was a way in. Certainly in those days, it was a way of doing what I describe as proper radio. And I think to this day, I think hospital radio does an amazing job.
Yeah.
Because it really is it's a grounding to learn those radio skills that quite frankly, you can't learn in a nightclub. You can't learn playing songs to drunk people in a nightclub. You've got to learn those radio skills.
Yeah.
So that was kind of where I got the bug, really, and it never went away. And I can remember one day being in a careers lesson, and the the career teacher going around the class and saying, what is it you want to do, and what is it you want to do, and most in the class were your standard answers of what I can't think of examples right now, but there was nothing surprising. Then she came to me and said, what is it you want to do? And I said, well, I want to work on the radio. I want to be a radio presenter. And she kind of almost laughed at me, and I can remember getting terribly embarrassed, and I was quite shy in those days, and almost feeling humiliated. But later, that humiliation, if you like, kind of turned to a bit of, okay, I'll teach you, I'll show you. And I'll show you what I can do. Exactly. So it kind of made me even more determined to make it, my career. And I, at 16 years of age, I can remember contacting Piccadilly Radio, because at the time we lived in an area called Hazel Grove, which is just outside Stockport in Greater Manchester. And so Piccadilly Radio was my local radio station, and I can remember contacting them one day and saying, "Look, can I come down and have a look round?" Because I didn't know how it worked. I had no idea how the whole thing worked. And there's an old saying, in showbiz that sometimes timing is everything. And at the time, they were looking for a volunteer for what was the Saturday sports show, somebody to get coffees and to run around with tapes and just generally to help out. And they said, well, come down for a little chat. And I got that job, all voluntary. It wasn't paid or anything like that, but that didn't matter to me. It was just the excitement of being in a radio station.
Of course, yeah.
And that's really how it all started for me.
Can you remember your very first show and what year that was?
I can remember the first show. It was, I joined, as I say, I left school on the Friday in July 78, and then I joined Piccadilly Radio on the Monday as kind of a production assistant. So that was July 78, and then would have been around about November. Because very, very quickly, because I joined the production department, making the ads and all those sorts of things. And then I started to voice commercials, and I can remember one day being in the production studio and the program controller coming down to me on a Friday afternoon and saying, "What are you doing tonight?" So I said, "Well, nothing. I'm going home when I finish this." And he said, "Well, would you be available to do this show tonight?" And what it was on a Friday night, they had a country music show. I knew nothing about country music. And bearing in mind I was 16 years of age, but my voice had been getting on the air because of the commercial. So the voice was becoming known. The name wasn't known, but the voice was becoming known. And he said, "Well, do you think you'd be able to do it? You've got a producer," and the show was pretty much scripted. Anybody who listening now, anybody in radio knows that radio isn't scripted. It's in the main, it's pretty much ad-libbed.
Yeah.
But this particular show was produced by a guy who was a country music enthusiast, and he pretty much scripted the show. So I agreed to do it. He left the room, and I just remember being just that knot in my stomach, being, and I wasn't physically sick, but I felt sick. And then as the clock ticked by, and the show started at 8 o'clock, I just got more and more nervous. And then when I opened the microphone at 8 o'clock, it was this very terrifying voice that came on the air. But that was the first show. The first show was kind of November 78, and by that time I was 17. So because my birthday's in September. So I joined at 16, had my birthday in September, I was 17. So my first show on the air, I was 17.
Wow.
But at that point, I became, apparently, the youngest presenter on British radio to ever host their own show.
Yeah.
So it was exciting times, and I look back, with very fond memories of that period.
For sure. And obviously it was a country song, was your first ever song that you played on the airwaves then. I bet you can't remember what it is.
Well, I suppose it was. I mean, that's a very good question, and nobody's ever asked me that before, and I don't know is the answer. I don't know what that song was. I mean, I have no idea.
It could be Stand By Your Man or Rhinestone Cowboy. It could be anything.
Well, I don't think it probably was anything as big as that. Having said that, though, just thinking now, actually that kind of wasn't my first show, because they, without confusing the story, they used to have a show on Piccadilly Radio called Magic Music, and it ran on a Saturday night, and it was just back-to-back music for 3 hours. It was way ahead of its time, really, Magic Music, because, you know, years later the gold format came into British radio, but this was way ahead of its time. It was probably about 15 years ahead of its time, this show. But anyway, this show on a Saturday night was back-to-back music, but the person that kind of put the records on and drove the show did a link into each news to introduce the news, and I did that from my second week into Piccadilly Radio. So I actually was 16, but it wasn't a full show, if that makes sense. I was putting the records on, I was playing the jingles, and I was putting the ads on, but it wasn't, if you like, the Steve Penk show. Yeah, it was just a music show. Yeah. But again, in answer to your question, what was the first record I ever played on the air? I can't remember. I don't know.
Of course, over time, you presented quite a lot of shows and became known as well for presenting breakfast shows on different stations. How did you motivate yourself to get up so early and pass on a life of nightclubbing, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's people used to say to me, "Oh, you must get used to it." You never get used to it. You talk to any breakfast radio presenter, and you never get used to it, because you're getting up in the middle of the night, and really from October to March is incredibly tough, because you're getting up in the pitch black. It's freezing cold. You're scraping the ice off your car. So you never get used to it, but what I loved about breakfast radio, and I still do, is that you know what your audience are doing. You know who you're broadcasting to. You're waking up the world. You're giving them, the news of the day for the first time, and it's a great buzz. I loved breakfast radio. I loved doing it. Yeah. But I loved it because I was given the freedom. I think, some radio shows now, for me, are overproduced. They sadly now, certainly with commercial radio, if you listen around the industry, or, you get in your car, maybe you drive for a living, and, you drive from north to south or south to north, and you flick around the various radio stations. They all sound the same. It's become too, it's too, it's kind of formula now, where you have a boy and a girl doing breakfast, and the girl does the travel news and the weather, and it's, so they all sound the same, but back then, every breakfast show in every market, every city across the country sounded different. Yeah. They were all, different in their own ways, and I loved that. I loved being part of that, I think a little bit of that is missing now in radio, if I'm really honest.
Yeah, and of course the wind-up calls came along. How did that start? Is that an idea that you'd had for a while and just thought, I'm going to go with this?
Yeah, well, Noel Edmonds had done them in the 70s when he did Breakfast on Radio 1, and then when Noel came off Breakfast, they kind of stopped. He didn't do a lot of them, but he did it. I can remember it was when I was in the car and I was being taken to school, and I can remember loving his breakfast show. And then, as I say, he came off the breakfast show in whenever it was, the mid-70s, I think, when he started the Multicoloured Swap Shop on BBC One. So for 20 years, or just slightly less than 20 years, they weren't on the radio. Excuse me. And then one day, I was reading my local newspaper, and somebody was selling a real Russian tank. It just said Russian tank for sale. And I was intrigued by this. So the following day on the show, I called it, and I asked various stupid questions. Does it come with a baby seat? Does the AA carry spare parts for it? Does it come with a, does it, has it got a radio in it? Various stupid questions. Don't tell me it's green. They're always green, aren't they? I want one that's a different colour. All those. Anyway, it got an incredible reaction.
Yeah.
And it grew from there. That was the moment it grew. That was the day that it started, and it became an important part of my life, really, because I suppose it became my calling card, and to a certain extent, it kind of still is.
Yeah, definitely. How did you manage to keep you cool, though? That's the big part of it. Biting your lip.
That's the great part about it. Was almost therapy. It was wonderful because I, if you like, I had control. Many times I was crying with laughter. But with a radio studio, I could close the microphone and compose myself. And the wonderful thing about the wind-up calls, is that you can talk to people in a way that, obviously, in real life, you can't, because you'd be punched in the mouth everywhere you went. So it was real therapy, And the great thing about it is that most of the time with my calls, people had nominated somebody. They'd nominated their wife or their husband or the best friend or somebody they work with. So you were hitting a nerve, by the very nature of being the guy from the council. You were hitting a nerve, and then as they started to die down, you give them a quick kick in the shins again, and off they go, But it was, it really was. It was like therapy, getting all these things you'd like to say to people around the office that you couldn't stand. You could say to these complete strangers on these wind-up phone calls.
Do you have a favourite one? Because I do so many, but do you have a favourite one?
This is a real cop out, really. But they're kind of all favourites, but in different ways.
Okay.
They've all got little stories behind them, and I love the ones where I've used sound effects, because it's the great thing about radio, as we both know, is that it really is that theatre of the mind, and everybody can picture their own little thing in their own little drama in the head, and so I like the ones with sound effects, and the ones where they just completely lose it and want to strangle you.
Yeah.
So they're all different, but they've all got a story behind them, and I enjoy them all.
Yeah, the listeners who've not heard these, you can find them all online on your website and enjoy them, because they are something to behold. They really are. Some of them are great. How you can get people to that point.
I've recently created a new DAB radio station in Manchester. Called the Steve Penk Wind-Up Channel, and it's absolutely unique. It's the very first radio station of this type in the world.
Yeah,
it doesn't play music; it's just back-to-back wind-up phone calls. And it's not. What I wanted to do was not just make it about my own calls. I wanted to showcase others around the world that I suppose are famous for wind-up phone calls. So it's a really fascinating listen, and you can listen to it by if you just go to your app store and search Steve Penk Radio. That's the name of the app. If you search Steve Penk Radio and then download the app, and then you can listen to the Wind-Up channel, and it's a good laugh, especially for the daily commute.
Yes, for sure. Well, Steve Penk, you've had a brilliant career, extended into TV, etc. So, for the listeners out there who are interested in getting into radio, you started on the Monday after finishing school on the Friday. What tips could you give somebody who wanted to start?
I think it's tougher now. I think it's tougher now than when I started, and you might find that a strange answer, considering that there are now about, 300 radio stations more than there were when I was trying to get into radio. But I think the problem is now is consolidation, because so many radio stations are owned by big radio groups, so they network the same show across whatever it is, 50, 60 radio stations. and because of that, a lot of us, certainly of my generation, we started off by, being volunteers, but also learning our craft on shows in the middle of the night. Well, although those shows still exist, there's only one of them because it's networked across 60 radio stations. So before, where there were 60 opportunities, there's only one opportunity.
Very true, yeah.
And also because it's going across 60 radio stations, you can't have somebody learning their craft. It's got to be somebody who's really good.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's catch-22. Well, how do I get on the air and become good if there aren't the opportunities? So my answer to your question is, I go back to where I started because it still exists, and that's hospital radio. If you contact your local major hospital, a lot of them still have hospital radio services, and also there's community radio now. There's community radio that wasn't there when I started, and those guys do a brilliant job as well. And there are many opportunities within community radio where you can get in there and help out, and perhaps get a show and just learn your craft.
Yeah.
And also my other advice would be listen. Listen a lot to people that you like. Don't copy them, but be inspired by them. Hear things that they do that you like and think, well, what can I do that's original and makes me different and stand out from the crowd? And so, there are opportunities, but you've got to look for them.
Yeah. And don't expect to go straight on the radio and be the next big thing without actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, don't expect. Yeah, absolutely. Don't expect to. If you go into it to be famous, then you've got the wrong frame of mind. I never ever went into radio, wanting to be famous or to earn lots of money. My driving force was, number one, my love of music that remains to this day, but and that was paired with my love of radio, and the two together were the two factors that drove me, and still do. I love radio as much today as I did 40 years ago, and if you were to talk to Tony Blackburn, this year is a huge anniversary for Tony. It's 50 years since he started Radio 1, and the guy is still doing it on the air, and that's amazing. It's amazing. He sounds as enthusiastic today as he did 50 years ago when he launched Radio 1. It's people like Tony that inspired me to go into radio. Him and Noel Edmonds, that were kind of my era of radio listening. And so again, listen to people on the radio that you like. Don't copy them, but be inspired by them. And good luck.
Solid advice, Steve Penk. Thank you very much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
You take care. Thank you very much.
All right, mate.